Please join me in welcoming our distinguished lecturer, Rami Khouri.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Do these microphones work? Everybody can hear? All right. I'll try it again. Go Wildcats. How's that? Is that better? No?
It was for a moment.
All right. Go Wildcats. How's that? All right. Here we go. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming out. Not only is it a pleasure for me to be here, I've been wanting to come visit the University of Arizona for many years, and logistics never worked out, but they did for this brief visit. But I also have the double pleasure of seeing my sister, who lives in Bisbee, friends from high school days 50 years ago in Geneva, friends from Jordan and Israel and Palestine, from the Middle East, who I haven't seen for a while, and I'm sure there's others I will meet throughout the evening. So it's a wonderful personal pleasure for me to be here, as well as a satisfying opportunity to exchange views with colleagues. I've already had some meetings with students and professors, and we'll talk to some more people at dinner this evening. And I would like to basically share with you some thoughts about the situation as I see it in Syria, about ISIS, about the Russians, Arab-Israeli issues, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and the United States Army, and other issues, all of which must be analyzed together for any of them to make any sense. Because one of the things that has changed in the Middle East now from 20 or 30 years ago, and I've been living and writing and reporting in the Middle East since 1971, which is around, 45 years. So I've lived through this whole process of the last almost half a century, writing about it journalistically. And the most important thing that's changed, in my view, is that we can no longer take one element. Like we used to be able to 30, 40 years ago, we say, well, let's study the Arab-Israeli situation, or let's study human rights in the Arab world, or let's study Turkey or something like that, or the Gulf oil-producing states. You can't study anything anymore on its own. You've got to put it in a wider context because of the tremendous interaction that is now taking place among so many different actors. The second point I would want to make is I think that we're passing through a moment now, and this is where Syria is so instructive and so depressing. We're passing through a moment in which the real drivers for political, social development, historic change in our region, the real drivers are the regional powers as much as the global powers. The global powers being the United States, Russia, and the Europeans a little bit here and there, but mostly the US and Russia, who are both actively at war now in different parts of the Middle East. But you now have Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia particularly, and Israel. Israel is kind of on the sidelines now. It's not directly involved it's indirectly involved in some of these issues, but Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and even countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are driving a lot of the actual developments, and the superpowers in many ways are responding. So this is a fascinating moment. To make it more complicated, you have also now many non-state powerful actors, Hezbollah, Hamas, Muqtada Sadr and his people, the Mahdi army people, the remnants of them, Iranian militias in Iraq, all the rebel groups in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, the so-called Islamic State and its various little affiliates. All of these non-state powerful actors are driving a lot of the developments in the region. And the combination of these non-state actors with popular uprisings a few years ago, continuing uprisings in some countries, with the rise of the regional powers, and the evolving role of the great powers makes the situation in the Middle East completely new, unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this, certainly in my lifetime. And to try to make sense of it is a little bit difficult. But before we do that, can we get some seats for some of the people standing up here? If anybody has a seat next to them, $5 for that seat up there. Any other seats back there? Seat, there's one up there. $10 up there, $5 here. Any other seats available?
I'll just stand over here so that seat's available.
All right, here's a young man who will give a seat to somebody who needs it. Thank you.
No problem.
There's one more down here. Here, there's a seat here. There's a seat here if you'd like. Okay. So trying to make sense of all the things that are going on in the region is very difficult and probably impossible to find one unifying theme or explanation for all of the things that are happening across the Middle East. But I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about what strike me as certain common elements, let's call them, across the region. I mentioned one of them, which is the rise of the regional powers. Not only their power, but their assertion. The way they go to war now, the way they fund rebel groups, the way they face down the superpowers or negotiate with the superpowers. There's new elements like that that we can see across the region. And I would say that the only way to understand really what's happening across the Middle East is to see it in the context of the last century, which I call a rather calamitous century for the Arab world. For Israel, Turkey, Iran, it's not so bad, and it's good in many ways. But for the Arab world, the last century from 1915 to 2015 has been very problematic. And it started with half a century of nation building and state building and the birth of countries, mostly at the hands of drunken European imperial retreating colonial powers. And some of them at the hands of marauding local armies of tribal soldiers taking over land and creating a state. And that combination of things created many of the Arab countries as they exist today. They went through half a century of quite impressive state building and nation building, education rates, employment rates, infrastructure building from the 1930s to the 1980s across most of the Arab world was extremely impressive. And there were moments in the 1980s when women's education rates in secondary school in Arab countries were higher than some of the countries in East Asia, the Asian tigers. So there were moments of great feats of state building. And those moments came to an end, basically. Hello? It must have been the Egyptian intelligence that. Oh, there we go. Those moments of. All right, we'll try it again. Hang on. It must be in here.
There we go.
Okay, I think it's the little wire. Those moments of state building and development from the 1930s to the 1980s it was a period of 50 years of sustained state building, and broadly speaking, the lives of the majority of people in the Arab countries were improving year after year. Their housing, schooling, medical care, transport systems, telephones, jobs, and national identities all were developing reasonably well across most of the Arab world, with one exception. There wasn't a single state that was built or developed on the basis of the principle of the consent of the governed. Not a single one. So we had very impressive economic development, state building, but zero political development. That period from the 30s to the 80s was punctuated by essentially two big issues. One was the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the second was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Other than that, throughout most of that period, you had movements and political parties and Arab nationalist sentiment and communists and Baathists and lefties and conservatives and Islamists. You had all these different groups, but none of them really were able to develop legitimate, mass-based political movements based on citizens who joined together to achieve political goals. Any significant mass movement was controlled from the top, so the Baathists or the Arab nationalists or the communists or some of the or the Islamist movements as well. And there was essentially no political development, sustained socioeconomic improvements across the region. That's why you had no popular uprisings in the Arab world, like you did starting in 2011 in Tunisia and Egypt, where masses of people went out onto the street to overthrow their governments. We never had that. The only one that I know of before was the overthrow of Numeidi in Sudan in 1986, or 85 or 86, and other than that, you had a colonel having a coup against a colonel and a general taking over from a colonel and somebody overthrowing a monarch, and like in Libya, but you had no mass popular uprisings, because for most people, life was improving and there was the hope constantly that your children were going to get an education, were going to get opportunities for professional development, were going to get opportunities for jobs, that life was improving, and the opportunities for a better life for your kids was going to be more significant than the opportunities that you have as an adult living in the Arab world in 1955 or 1972 or any of that of those moments. The Arab-Israeli conflict I'll mention only briefly tonight because it's not the main subject of my discussion, but it's always there in the background. And as you see with the events today, it keeps coming back as a violent conflict, a war between two people, Palestinian Arabs and Jewish Zionist Israelis, who both feel that they have rights to their homeland and state in the historic land of Palestine. The Israeli state exists, the Palestinian state doesn't, and the tensions between them, which started really in the 1920s and then accelerated after the Holocaust in a big way with the large Jewish immigration and the reaction of the Arabs to the expansion of Jewish settlements and communities, and Arabs started feeling in the 30s and 40s that the Zionists or the Jews coming from Europe actually wanted to create a state or a homeland, and they did, and they were successful. They created Israel in 1948, and ever since then the conflict has been going on nonstop. We're in the 5th generation of Palestinians. My grandparents in the 20s, my parents in the 40s. I was born in 1948. My children born in 1980, and my granddaughter now born in New York, but of Palestinian identity. And we're the 5th generation, and the 5th generation is the one in Jerusalem that's now fighting in a vicious way, fighting against the Israeli who they feel occupy them in East Jerusalem. And this is a continuation of a problem that's been going on for almost 100 years, the conflict between Zionism and Arabism in Palestine. And the Israelis also are fighting and killing Palestinians. The kill ratio is around 5 to 1. For every 5 Palestinians who are killed, 1 Israeli is killed. The injury ratio is more like 500 to 1. There's thousands of Palestinians who've been injured, 1,600 or so in the last month, and the Israelis are 60 or 70 or 80. So there's a huge imbalance in the power of the two groups, but the intensity of their determination to fight for what they believe is their homeland is undiminished on both sides and unresolved after a quarter century, 25 years, of a monopoly of mediation by the United States, which has been totally incompetent, a total failure of trying to mediate a permanent peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The United States has been unable to do it for reasons that people debate for days and days on end. And therefore, I believe that a new formula is needed to achieve a permanent peace that gives the Israelis their Jewish majority state, which, as it is now, gives the Palestinians their state, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and resolves the Palestinian refugee in an equitable way based on UN resolutions and the international rule of law, while recognizing that Israel will remain a Jewish majority state as it is now, about 80%, 75-80% Jewish. That process should be doable if you had a serious mediator and good leadership among the Israelis and the Palestinians. We don't have any of those three elements today. So there's no possibility right now of any kind of breakthrough. But I mentioned the Arab-Israeli conflict because in the background of all of the developments taking place in the region, it must always be recognized, I believe, as the most destabilizing and radicalizing dynamic in the Middle East over the last 60, 70 years. There isn't a lot of mention of the Arab-Israeli conflict today in terms of ISIS or Syria or Yemen or Libya. But indirectly, the Arab-Israeli conflict has had a significant impact on conditions in the Arab world, negative conditions, worsening conditions, in many different ways, which I don't have time to get into now, but I've written about this. You can read it in my columns. But the Arab-Israeli conflict, to me, remains the single most promising focus of a peace process that could, if it resolves the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I believe is resolvable through a peaceful negotiation, would have the most impact on quieting things down in other parts of the region or allowing other countries to focus on other things, including their internal development, including fighting ISIS, including dealing with extremist movements and many of the other things, and getting on with national development that is sustainable, rational, integrated, humanistic, and is not sidelined by the single greatest detriment to the modern development of the Arab world, which has been the reality of military regimes that rule our countries. And military regimes started to take power in our countries in the late 40s in ways, but really in 52 in Egypt. And much of the rationale for these military people to take over, and then later Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and the generals in Egypt and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen and Omar Hassan al-Bashir in Sudan and Abdulaziz Bouteflika and the generals in Algeria. You go across the whole place, the whole region, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia. You go across one by one and you name the leaders of these countries, and they're all former army generals, all of whom took power undemocratically, none of whom were accountable to their people. They governed these countries, in some cases, the Assad family, still the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, his father took over in 1970. Some of these people have been in power for 45, 50 years now, and they're still running these countries, and for the most part, without exception, the countries run by military generals have been run into the ground, have been destroyed as decent, efficient, humane countries. So you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at Libya, you look at Yemen, you look at Tunisia, you look at Egypt and Sudan, across the board. And that to me has been the single biggest problem across the Arab world in the modern period. And the development burst that happened from the 30s to the 80s then started going downhill in the early 1980s. Because what happened in the 1970s, most of the non-monarchies in the Arab world were taken over by military people. Their families and their crony capitalist friends and their cousins and their business associates ran these governments, benefited from immense access to wealth, most of it illicitly gained, became fabulously rich, and ordinary people's lives started to decline slowly, 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 because population growth was much faster than economic growth. Per capita real income deteriorated. Development spending, which had been quite impressive in the first 50 years of statehood, after the 1980s focused on the capital region, and rural areas were pretty much forgotten. There was disproportionate spending on areas where the ethnic population was related to the great leader, and therefore you ended up with a terrible situation in many Arab countries of uneven development, inequitable development, massive abuse of power by state authorities who were controlled by families that were anchored in the security systems. So what had been a nationalist development state in the Arab world across most of the regions, states that were developing, genuinely helping most of their people, with a sense of nationalism for their own well-being as countries, and with a wider sense of Arab nationalist solidarity with other Arab people working together. The Arab nationalist state in the 1980s transformed into essentially a security state in which citizens were transformed into consumers. And starting in the 1980s, you still had no rights, and you still no political rights, but you didn't even have developmental advantages either, as you did in the previous 3 generations. So starting in the 1980s, you could go out and buy as many cell phones as you want, but you had no other real rights as a citizen other than to be a consumer. So it's no surprise that in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, we started to see the rise of serious Islamist mass movements, mainly with the Muslim Brotherhood, mainly nonviolent and peaceful, with small offshoots of violent ones like the ones who killed Sadat or the ones who challenged the Syrian government, but predominantly peaceful, nonviolent Muslim Brotherhood movements that were a response to the increasingly difficult life that people were living at the socioeconomic level and at the political level, combined with 2 other forces that have been problematic for people in the Arab world. One is the continual humiliation and defeat by Israel of individual or combined Arab armies. Repeatedly, the Israelis defeated us militarily because we were as incompetent at warfare as we were at governance. Unfortunately, I say this with great sadness. But the management of these countries, the Arab countries, was very low quality, and militarily the Israelis kept humiliating us and defeating us. And the second thing that was going on, and then of course also colonizing land, annexing the Golan Heights, colonizing East Jerusalem and West Bank and parts of Gaza, from which they withdrew under pressure but then laid siege to Gaza. So there was terrible tensions between the Israelis and the Arab countries, which added to the frustrations and humiliations and sense of deprived citizenship of so many millions and millions of people in the Arab world. And the second factor that was continuous was the military intervention of foreign powers, Western powers mainly, but sometimes also the Russians, or Soviets back then, or Russians, and more recently, the Iranians, the Iranian military presence in the Arab countries. So these foreign, and now recently the Turks a little bit, in limited areas. So foreign countries constantly coming at us with their military assets, waging war, helping movements, doing whatever they wanted to do in our country. And the final factor was, again, with all of these negative things that I mentioned, with real income declining, no political rights, socioeconomic distress, poverty and marginalization and vulnerability increasing, the final factor was a very strong and consistent support for the Arab autocratic security state, family-run dictatorships, support from the international powers, the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians more recently, actively supporting these frozen, decrepit political and socioeconomic systems. The Arab oil states, the oil-producing states, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they did a little bit better because they had a lot of money, they had smaller populations, and they tended to be better managed, as monarchies tend to be, which is a fascinating subject that political scientists and political psychologists need to study. Why are monarchies more responsive to the needs of their citizens? So Morocco or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or others tend to be more responsive. They're not any more democratic, but they're more sensitive to what their citizens need, and therefore you don't have, again, big popular uprisings in these countries. So that brings us to the 1990s and the continued pressure on a population that was 60 million in 1930. There were 60 million Arabs in 1930, and today there's 370 million. 60 million to 370 million. 2 million Egyptians were born last year. 2 million every year, 2 million Egyptians are now born. And the Arab world is faced with this immense pressure of population growth and almost chronic incompetence by the governments in addressing the basic social and economic needs of their citizens. And things like water, agricultural production, transportation. So we have a very bad trajectory that we've lived through in the last 30 years in the Arab world with declining per capita living standards. About 20% of the Arab world is wealthy and well off. Either the oil producing states, and they're not all wealthy, some of them have poor people as well, but the oil producing states and the elites in all the other countries. So in Jordan and Morocco and Egypt, Tunis, there's about 15% of the population that's living very comfortably. Professional people, people near the regime, but the vast majority are not living comfortably. And what happened in December 17, 2010, when Mohammed Bouazizi, a fruit and vegetable seller in the Sidi Bouzid town of rural southwest poverty-stricken Tunisia, set himself on fire and sparked the biggest mass political spontaneous movement in the modern history of the Arab world, maybe in the whole history of the Arab world, I don't know, where thousands of people demonstrated in Tunisia and then overthrew the regime there, and then in Egypt, and in Libya, and Syria, and Yemen, Bahrain, and smaller demonstrations in Jordan and Oman and other places. A tremendous movement spread across the Arab world spontaneously. Why? Because of the 370 million Arabs, I would say conservatively 200 million, and this is just my rough ballpark figure based on my last 45 years of traveling and living in the region and studying it. I would say about 200 million out of the 370 million Arabs understood exactly why Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. Because he had lost any hope of enjoying that critical factor of national development and integrity and stability that had defined the previous 5 generations in the Arab world. He had lost the sense that his life and his children's life or his brothers and sisters' life would improve with time. And the critical element, the critical dynamic that sparked these uprisings and these revolutions, and that caused millions of people in the area to be glued to Jazeera watching this every day in December 2010, January, February, March, April 2011, and throughout 2011. The critical factor was that individual men and women no longer felt they had the ability to improve their life conditions by going to school, by working hard, by obeying the law, by being loyal to their government, by following the rules. They felt that option was no longer open to them. They had reached a state of hopelessness, and it was captured in those few hours of December 17, 2010 by Mohammed Bouazizi, a young fruit and vegetable seller who had to drop out of school to make enough money to keep his mother and brothers and sisters alive and going to school. And he would sell fruits and vegetables from his cart. And he'd make probably $10, $15 a day, something like that, but that was enough for them to buy what they need and go to school and buy food and stay alive, expecting that life was going to improve, that his brothers and sisters would graduate from high school, maybe go to college, maybe get a good job. And what happened was, in the span of a few hours, the two government representatives of his own government in his hometown in rural southwest Tunisia, a policewoman and the governor's office, treated him like a piece of dirt. The policewoman came and overturned his vegetable cart, took his scale. He couldn't weigh stuff and he couldn't sell, he couldn't make money. And this was done apparently arbitrarily. He couldn't work anymore simply because the policewoman decided to do that to him. Maybe she wanted a bribe, maybe, we don't know. So he was deprived by his own government of making a living and keeping his family alive. Then he went to the governor's office to complain. And he went to knock on the door of the governor's office to say, look, I was mistreated by this police lady. Give me my scales back. And the governor's office told him, go away, there's nobody here. Of course, there was somebody there. The governor was there, everybody was there. They just didn't care. They didn't want to talk to him. And that's when he went off and set himself on fire. Because he realized, we assume he died, we don't know. We realized that he realized that he just had no power as a citizen or as a human being. He had absolutely no meaning. His life had no meaning. He had no power, he had no value, he had no rights, he had no mechanism for seeking a redress of grievance, he had no political action capabilities as a citizen. He didn't count. He didn't exist. He was an invisible man in his own community in the face of the two official representatives of his government who live in his town. And the uprising spread because I would guess hundreds of millions of Arabs precisely understood how he felt, because they felt exactly the same way. They felt that in their communities, in their homes, in their countries, in their political structures, they also had no rights, they also had no opportunities. And if they weren't living well and had some money saved away and they owned their home and could take care of their basic needs, they lived a life of great vulnerability. And the sense that drives somebody to this point of killing himself or herself is supported by two statistics I'm going to give you. And then I'm going to get to Russia and Syria and ISIS, but you need to understand this background. Two statistics. 60% of all new entrants to the labor market in Egypt, 60% go into the informal sector. What does that mean? It means they have no health insurance, they have no minimum wage, they have no contracts, they have no social security, they have no defined working hours, they have no labor health standards, no protection. They're totally informal workers. They carry sacks of potatoes, they clean somebody's car, they run errands around town, they sweep floors, they might, if they're lucky, they might drive somebody's broken down old taxi. 60% of all new entrants, and what does all new entrants means? It means the youngest people who dropped out of school or even graduated from school go into the informal sector. The worst news is that educational testing that has been done internationally for many, many years, the latest statistics from 2-3 years ago show that across the Arab world, on average, about 45 to 50% of middle primary and middle secondary school. Between 45 and 50% of kids in Arab public schools at mid-secondary and mid-primary school are not able to read and write and cannot do basic numeracy, cannot do basic arithmetic. Almost half of the kids in primary and secondary school are not learning anything. That's why they drop out. And to make it even worse, about 26 million kids in primary and secondary school are not in school now. And that number, by the way, is increasing because of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and Libya, the active wars in those countries. As well as people just dropping out of school because they need to go and make $5 a day to keep their kids, their families, and their brothers and sisters and parents alive. So we probably are closer to 30 million out of school by now. The figure of 22, 25 million was from last year. And in the last week, 40,000 Syrians, in 1 week, 40,000 Syrians crossed into Europe. Risk their lives getting into Europe. There are about 7,000 per day crossing into 7,000 to 8,000 a day in the last week. We're leaving Syria and trying to get to Greece and Europe. I mean, these are astonishing figures. And what do they tell us? They tell us that these societies have failed their own people in education, in jobs, in civic rights, in political rights, in national identity, in almost any criterion you want to choose. We have societies that have been run into the ground across much of the Arab world. And this is why we had these incredible uprisings 4 years ago and why some people are still fighting. So when we look at Syria and Russia and ISIS, what do we see? We see the worst manifestation of domestic, regional, political, national, economic, religious, ideological, and international dynamics. The worst of all of those dynamics compressed into one country. I'm talking about Syria initially, but I could be talking about Iraq as well. But Syria and Iraq both are pretty calamitous in their own ways. These countries capture all of the bad things that have happened in the Arab world since the 1960s, since the 1970s maybe. The regimes that took power there took power in the 70s. The Ba'ath in Iraq with Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad in Syria about 1970, 75. These two individuals took power. Their parties took power before. Military rule, family-run military rule, ethnic-based military rule, total lack of democratic rights, mismanagement of economic and social resources of the state, a human development, national development process that had peaked in the 70s and then was driven into the ground because of the incompetence and brutality of the regimes that were actively supported by the United States and Russia and Europe and others. And then we had the uprisings. The uprisings started in Iraq. In the Kurds and the Shiites in the 1990s, before the uprisings of the December 2010. They were brutally suppressed. We had the intervention of foreign military powers, the American various wars and sanctions on Iraq in the 90s and beyond. The active engagement of the Russians in supporting some of these dictatorial regimes. Now the active military involvement of the US in Syria and Iraq, again, after many years of fighting in Iraq after overthrowing the regime. And the creation in Iraq in 2003, because of the Anglo-American-led invasion, and wiping out the state that existed. Bad as that state was, it was a state, and it provided a certain stability, inequitable, undemocratic, but there was a stability of some sorts. That was wiped away by the Anglo-American invasion, creating the vacuum and the chaos that opened the door for the Al-Qaeda initial group that came into Iraq in 2004, 2005, headed by a Jordanian called Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, a young Islamist fanatic terrorist who was radicalized in Jordanian jails. Like the head of Qaeda, now Ayman al-Zawahiri, was radicalized in Egyptian jails. So what you had was in Iraq, as al-Qaeda took root and then started changing into ISIS around 2006, 2008, they declared Islamic State of Iraq, and then they moved into Syria. The origins of ISIS go back to 2004 in Iraq. And what are the two forces that came together in Iraq to create that environment that allowed ISIS to take root and then grow? Arab autocratic regimes and the policies of political subjugation that radicalized their own citizens in their own jails. Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all over the region, combined with active American and British militarism that overthrew the regime in Iraq and created the environment of chaos in which these guys could do their thing. That combination of Western, particularly American militarism, but now also Russian militarism, foreign militarism, and Arab autocracy are the creators of the environment that gave birth to ISIS. They're the midwives of ISIS, inadvertently, for sure. I don't subscribe to the theory that ISIS was created by the United States, not at all. But American policies and Arab autocratic regimes created this environment from which ISIS developed. And how did al-Qaeda grow? How was al-Qaeda born, and how did it expand and aim at American targets? It was the consequence of two big powers' military interventions in Islamic countries. The Russians in Afghanistan, the Americans in Saudi Arabia. The first one is when al-Qaeda was born. The second one is when it flourished and turned against the United States. So these factors, that's why I say you can't study any of these issues by themselves. Arab democracy, human rights abuses, foreign militarism, Arab-Israeli issues, economic mismanagement, foreign support for Arab dictators. These things all form an integrated cycle that leads us to where we are today. So in Syria, we've reached really the zenith of bad things that can happen as a consequence of these trends that I'm mentioning. And ISIS grew out of this process basically for two reasons, I think. There's many ideas about ISIS. There's many very good books, by the way, that are now being written about ISIS. But essentially, ISIS is an extreme, radical, criminal reaction to the trends that I have described, the negative trends that really defined, I would say, at least 2/3 of the Arab people. Again, maybe 1/3 or 1/4 were living fine, but the majority of Arabs were not living fine. And that's why you had these big uprisings, and that's why you had the previous signal in the 70s and 80s and 90s of the mass development of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. The Muslim Brotherhood movement was a reaction to these autocratic political regimes, lack of citizen rights, humiliation by Israel, humiliation by Western military powers, all of economic stress, all of the bad things that I mentioned that people suffered for decade after decade. The first sign of mass reaction was the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the 70s and 80s. And a few of them became violent, but most of them were peaceful. The second sign was the mass immigration of our best and brightest young people. There's tens of thousands of brilliant young Arab bankers and engineers and doctors and lawyers and professors, and they're all outside the Arab world because they had no chance to achieve their full potential professionally and personally, or to live a decent life politically in Arab countries, so they left. And I don't blame any of them for leaving. I decided to stay because there was an incredible development taking place that I felt as a journalist and Arab I wanted to experience and to write about. And the third warning sign we had was Al-Qaeda. The development of Al-Qaeda has a very, very small movement, and it remains a small movement, partly because it didn't resonate with people in the Arab world or the Arab Islamic societies. Very small numbers of people followed it initially, a few hundred here or there, maybe a few thousand here or there. But this was not a serious mass movement, but it was a red sign, a red warning light that something was so wrong in our societies that people would go and create this kind of movement to try to overthrow Arab regimes, fight against foreign powers, and try to create societies that are based on what they consider to be true Islamic principles. So we had three very important warning signs. And then the fourth one, of course, was the uprisings of 2010-2011, which was the final straw, which had nothing to do with Islamic movements, had nothing directly to do with Arab-Israeli issues, had nothing directly to do with foreign military interventions or oppression. All of these things were factors in people's lives, but they were indirect behind the scenes. The uprisings were basically the consequence of millions and tens of millions of people who, as I said, had lost any hope of living a decent life for their kids, especially. Kids who were, half of them were not learning anything in school and could look forward only to a life of informal employment, perpetual poverty, chronic marginalization, pauperization, vulnerability, people who would live their lives like Mohammed Bouazizi with no rights, no dignity, no opportunity, no hope. They were people who had given up the idea that they could live in a better society in their own countries, and they do what most people do in such situations. They have a revolution. They have an uprising. Totally unplanned, totally unscripted, leaderless for the most part, and it has resulted in a lot of the chaos we see today because the counter-revolutionary forces, including foreign interventions, including interventions from within the Arab world, fought back. The military regimes in Syria and Egypt and other places fought back, and you had active intervention by some of the Gulf countries, some foreign countries, by Iran, Russia, and Syria to push back these uprisings, and this is the situation we're at today. So what do we see in Russia, Syria, and ISIS in the context of this history that I've tried to encapsulate for you? We see all of the bad trends of the last century coming together, creating the sort of worst possible outcome, which is a rebellion in Syria that started peacefully, turned into an active military war within the country, with the regime fighting back militarily very brutally against its own people, and then its own people started mobilizing militarily. Foreign countries and Arab countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan, and Egypt, and other people, all actively, and then Turkey, all actively sending support to their favorite rebels to overthrow Assad, or some people like Iran and Russia sending support to help Assad stay in power. So what started as a peaceful uprising, like the one in Tunisia and Egypt, turned into a domestic civil war, which then turned into a regional conflict between Arab and Iranian forces who kept the government in place and others who wanted to drive it out. And finally, the Americans and the Russians and the Europeans have now been involved actively with their jets, fighting and shooting and killing. So we now have the biggest, most complicated proxy war I would say of the last century. I don't know if this is worse than the Spanish Civil War, but it certainly seems to me worse because of the intensity of the fighting going on, the number of local, regional, and international actors that are involved, and the impossibility of achieving a political settlement. The latest, the most serious development was the emergence of ISIS, creating this Islamic State, a so-called Islamic State, which has gained some territory and controls some territory. I believe the Islamic State is very weak. I don't think it's a long-term phenomenon, except if it remains in a situation like today, where basically the local and regional powers are not coordinating a military response to defeat it. If you just have airstrikes by Americans and British and an occasional Saudi and now the Russians, and that's not going to do it. You need to have coordinated land forces from Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds, Turks, Jordanians, Saudis, Iranians, whoever wants to fight them, defeat them, with aerial attacks, and they can be defeated very easily. These are not, Islamic State is not a mass movement like, say, the Muslim Brotherhood that has millions of adherents. It's a small cult-like movement that started and could only take shape, could only take root, could only be daring enough to declare this state and this so-called caliphate because of the total chaos all around it. That's the only reason it could do that. And you see this anywhere you see the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda groups springing up, or their affiliates like Shabab in Somalia, Boko Haram, Islamic State in the Maghreb, Islamic State in Yemen, different places. The only places these groups take root and emerge is zones of chaos and total destruction and societies where there's no order, there's no control, there's no government. And a lot of that is a consequence of the domestic depravity of the governments and the conditions that they created in these countries, combined with the international military actions that help create this situation. Who are the people who join ISIS? Who are the people who support ISIS? These are mostly young men or middle-aged men who have completely given up any hope of a normal life and see in ISIS a desperate promise of some kind of better life, with order, with jobs, with electricity, with bread, with a life that has some meaning to them. And you have to see this in the context of cult-like movements. These are like small cults. People who go and join cults in the United States go to join these cults because they have a need in their life to be part of a group that gives meaning to them, that gives purpose to their life, that gives them solidarity, gives them fraternity, friendship, support, and a sense of order, a sense of mission in life. When you combine this with the basic fundamental scriptures of Islam, and you say that this is what God wants Muslims to do, it becomes even more powerful for Muslims who are so down and out that they would go and join a movement like this out of sheer and utter desperation, because it's their last hope of having a decent life. There are some members of ISIS, no doubt, who are very devout, very serious Muslims who believe that this is actually the apocalyptic moment and the end of time is coming and the Mahdi is coming back, and we need to create the Islamic State now for the Mahdi to come back, because the end of days are here. But there's very few people, and the overwhelming majority of Muslims feel that these guys are extremist, people behaving strangely, to put it nicely. I mean, and then the foreigners who go and join them. There's an exaggerated coverage in the press of Americans and British and Belgians and people who go join the Islamic State from overseas. Again, these are lost young souls who would normally either go join a cult or a motorcycle gang to find meaning to their life, but the Islamic State then becomes an option for them. Many of the people who go join the Islamic State are radicalized in jails in Western countries. Some of them are They just convert to Islam and go, and many of them have no idea what they're going to do. Again, there's some who are probably very, very devout Muslims who think this is actually the time of the return of the Messiah, of the Mahdi, but the majority I don't think are like that. And the return, the creation of the Islamic State is only a more extreme form of the autocratic state system that the Arab world has experienced in the last 100 years. It's just a little bit more extreme than what the Arab people have suffered in many cases. There are forms of Islam that are dominant in the region that are very extreme, very harsh, and this is the latest, most extreme and harshest one. And the entry of Russia into this, finally, and I'll stop here so we can have some discussion. The entry of Russia into this process is fascinating on a whole different level, and it has really very little to do with the Arab world and the Middle East. I believe the entry of Russia into Syria marks the end of this period from 1990 till now, which people have called the post-Cold War period, because we didn't know what to call it. People had various names that they thought, but there wasn't a good explanation for this period from 1990 until today. Some thought it was the Americans dominating the world. Some people thought it was a unipolar world. Some thought it was the end of history. There was all kinds of ideas that came about, but none of them made a lot of sense because they weren't consistent. But what we have now is a dramatic move by Russia to say, well, the post-Cold War period is over, and this is now a new moment in global geostrategic and political and military relationships. I don't believe the Russians are interested in challenging the United States, but they're basically trying to re-establish their credentials in the Middle East, help an old ally that they've held for 50 years or so, revive their role regionally in the area with Iran, maybe with Turkey, with Syria. There's Saudis and Egyptians are going to Moscow every other month for strategic meetings. They're selling weapons. So the Russians are taking advantage of this moment of change with the United States readjusting its relationships in the region, and the Russians are filling in some of these vacuums that are being created. They don't expect to replace the Americans, nor do they want to challenge them across the board, but they want to regain their foothold in the region and to be in a situation where they can rekindle their relationships, economic, political, and oil, energy, and technology with people around the region, especially people in some cases who are disappointed with the United States and maybe the Europeans. And the Russian military involvement closes that circle that started with European military involvement here 100 years ago. The Europeans first came in militarily, and then the Americans took over in the 1970s and 80s, and now the Russians are in, and we've got now a complete circle of foreign military direct action in the region, which exacerbates that basic fundamental problem which I mentioned in the beginning, which is the destructive role of Western militarism combined with support for Arab dictators and autocrats in non-democratic societies. So the Russian involvement can only make things worse in the short and medium term. The Iranian involvement in Syria equally is only going to make things worse. Hezbollah's involvement in Syria, all of these military involvements are going to complicate the situation. There is no military solution to political problems, and there is no foreign military involvement that can bring a solution to indigenous political problems. And why the big powers don't learn this simple lesson, I don't know. But this is how the world works. And I think we just have to let this conflict in Syria play itself out. Unfortunately, there is no political solution in sight right now, unless one side militarily defeats the other, which is possible. I don't rule that out. But there's going to have to be eventually some kind of political settlement. And what we're going to see it could be in a year, it could be in 5 years, is the beginning of that reconfiguration of Arab political systems, which should have happened 100 years ago, but never did. So what we're seeing 100 years after the birth of the modern Arab world is, I believe, the preparatory steps for the mechanisms by which, for the first time ever in modern history, indigenous Arabs can shape their own political systems, maybe define their own borders. If the Kurds end up being their own country, the South Sudanese already seceded and created their own country. Yemen may divide again, we don't know. Syria may end up being a federal state. We may be seeing the early stages of the reconfiguration of the Arab world, which for the first time ever would be based on the indigenous will of the people themselves. But they don't get to this situation very easily. Unfortunately, we're passing through now the worst military phases of this, and this is something that's going to have to play itself out until either one side beats the other, or everybody gets so exhausted, like in the Lebanese Civil War or the Northern Ireland or in South Africa, where people get so exhausted that they accept a political resolution that gives everybody equal rights. So there's good news and there's bad news, but I think we're passing through a historical moment in which ISIS, Syria, and Russia are reflections of these terrible trends that we've had in the past, but at the same time encapsulate the seeds of that indomitable desire of ordinary Arab men and women to live like dignified citizens in their own free and democratic countries. Thank you very much.